Hello, welcome back. My name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholars' virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Matthew Palczynski. Matt holds a Ph.D. in art history from the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, and Matt is an art historian and consultant who believes that art-related experiences can teach us a lot about ourselves and the world around us. He's based in Palo Alto, as you can tell, and he has given hundreds of lectures at museums, universities, and organizations worldwide. His most recent and upcoming talks include those for Stanford, Microsoft, the Wharton School, and the Barnes Foundation. And of course, this is Matt's second virtual lecture with us. So welcome back, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Lovely to be back here. I want to say at the beginning how nice it is to be here with you all, to be looking at one of the great artists of all time, certainly one of the great artists of the history of modernism, and more importantly, to give us something to chew on. You probably know that the name Picasso rings all kinds of bells for all kinds of people. There would be people who would automatically say the word genius or precocious, and there would be other people who would say, this is not the kind of art that I'm comfortable with, and these are not the kind of ideas I've ever spent time thinking about. And welcome to both of you and anyone else who occupies a different position. This is one of those opportunities where we can sit back, wherever we are, hopefully comfortably, look out the window, listen, take in new things, see if we can massage our opinions of some of these ideas, see if we can move us beyond what we thought we knew about Picasso or what we thought we knew about some of the subjects that he worked with, and go from there. This is one of the great opportunities, I think, of spending so much time, those of us who are sheltering in place, that we can really go back and read the books that we haven't read and watch the films that we haven't seen, or in our case, take another crack at one of the most complex and beautiful and interesting artists from the history of time. Those of us who were here in part one will remember that we left off with Picasso at the moment that he's evolving. Picasso was born in 1881, and so by the time we get to 1906, you've got quite a bit of time there, especially for someone who was as precocious and prolific and truly gifted as he was in the early years. You'll remember around 1900, Picasso makes the decision to be in Paris. There are other art capitals of the world at that point, and certainly other art capitals in Europe. Picasso has run through Barcelona, Madrid. He's already, in his mind, mastered the art capitals there. And the next best place to go is Paris. Paris is unquestionably the epicenter of the art world. Certainly the epicenter at that point of the budding avant-garde modernist group of artists who are trying to change things, trying to work against some of the systems, in some cases working within some of the systems to critique from within. But by 1906, Picasso has fallen under the spell of one of the most interesting people in Paris at that time, Gertrude Stein. And as you remember last time, we looked at Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein and all of the wonderful anecdotes that go along with it. It's the middle of winter. Notice the cloak that she's wearing. She's in his very cold studio, time after time after time. There are 90 sessions, 90, for Gertrude Stein to sit for Picasso. And at the end of the sessions, we have something that is quite remarkable. It's a painting that shows Picasso trying to come to terms with something he's newly very interested in. And that is the kind of art that would today be considered non-Western, the kind of art that came out of Africa or the Iberian Peninsula, a kind of either pre-modern or outside of Europe art. Picasso was absolutely taken by this. He would have seen different masks and objects at places in Paris, not at the proper museums we think, but one example would be at the Ethnographic Museum at the Trocadero. Picasso mentioned his interest, his love for non-Western masks once. He said the masks weren't just like any other pieces of sculpture, not at all. They were magic things, he said. So keep that somewhere in your brain, magic things. For him, Picasso is trying to figure out a way to understand these magic things, which today we know that's not how all of these objects function, and to incorporate them into his work. And so with Gertrude Stein, look at the face. You get a sense that this is not a photographic depiction of her. Instead, this is a moment for him to try to bring together two paradigms of art, the tradition that he's been exposed to in the art academies and indeed all around him. And on the other hand, a kind of art that no one has yet bothered to understand quite yet. No one has bothered to do the anthropological and sociological legwork yet. And certainly only a few artists are trying to make sense of how to incorporate those magical things, those non-Western objects, into their own work. At the left, earlier in the year, in the winter, at the right, things have changed. Self-portrait with palette. He's getting into the warmer months here. This is confident Picasso. He has found a way to incorporate his love of non-Western objects, masks in particular, and has created a kind of painting that looks as at once like a recognizable figure, and then on the other hand, like something coming completely out of his imagination. At the right, the self-portrait with palette shows you a very confident Picasso not even needing to hold a paintbrush. This is Picasso working in the summer of 1906, intensely hot. He's sunburned, often works naked. So the stories tell us here. Another anecdotal piece of this is that when disturbed, when he's focused on painting, he would go into these rages while and if he's interrupted. So this is a very interesting time for him. He's growing, he's learning, he's figured out what it's going to take in his mind to move art forward. And it begins with the love he has for non-Western art. This is also the moment, right at the moment when he's gaining in confidence and pushing his art along to a new place. This is the moment that one of the great artists of the time, who will subsequently become more and more revered in the canon of the history of art, certainly also in the canon of modern art. This is a moment when more artists in Paris become aware of the work of Paul Cézanne. Here at the left, his own self-portrait with palette. So Picasso is very consciously borrowing from not only the subject that Cézanne presents us, but the kind of confident declaration of an artist at work, showing you her or his work. Cézanne, who would become one of the leaders of modernism, or the foundation of modernism, dies in October 1906. 1905, the year before, about 10 of Cézanne's works were installed at the Autumn Salon in Paris. And so there's, for viewers who hadn't seen anything like the work of Cézanne, this is the baby steps toward really seeing how gifted he was. The next year, 1906, 10 more works hung at, again, the Autumn Salon of that year. But it's really in 1907, right at the time when Picasso is digging through his own baggage about what kind of style he should work with, what kind of imagery he should work with, that a major retrospective is held at yet another Autumn Salon, and this will be the Salon of 1907. So in 5 and 6, we get a couple works exhibited. By 7, there's a huge retrospective of works by Cézanne, and more people see his work, and more people become aware, especially if you're a painter like Picasso, a young painter like Picasso, that Cézanne is really the one to follow here. This is the reason that Picasso said that Cézanne was the father of us all. The reason that Matisse said, if he is right, then I'm right. If there is one person to follow at this point, 1906 into 1907 for Picasso, it's Paul Cézanne. Why is that? When you look at this painting, maybe you're seeing something that most people see immediately. No fault here at all. You're seeing what we are trained neurologically to see. When we see recognizable images, we immediately put those images into a context of what we've seen before, a context of our own lives. So our brain does this sort of shortchanging to come up with a very quick answer, a kind of perception built around recognizing familiar visual imagery. And so you might be looking at this saying, well, these are just fruits on a table. This is just a jug. These are other objects that I recognize. And Cezanne knew that. And so one of the interesting things with his work is that Cezanne is taking recognizable images and the fact that we look at recognizable images and project onto them what we think they should be, and he's upending that. Because actually, if you look more carefully at how these objects are painted, you get a sense that these are not the objects that we know and love from our life. These apples appear as such that they could roll right off that plate and certainly right off that table, where objects like the little sugar bowl there seem to hover in space, where the jugs in the back present a kind of imagery where you can see them up close and away, but also have the ability to look inside of them, inside the jugs. You can see that the green one especially has a lip at the top that's tipped up in such a way that allows you to look in. For Cezanne, scholars call this passage, a kind of two perspective at once, where I'm looking over at a jug, but then I'm looking in it. You're not able to do this in the real world. So Cezanne is playing with perspective here in such a way as to really get us thinking about what painting is. Is painting merely a copy of the real world? Or is painting, on the other hand, an opportunity for artists to play, and sometimes fast and loose, with subjects that we think we know? Here again, the bathers. We all know bathers, we all know nude people, and we even know this setting, the background here, the trees, the blue of the atmosphere, the brownish of the ground. These things make sense to us logically. But when we look at it pictorially, suddenly, very quickly, we realize this doesn't add up. Doesn't add up that some of the limbs aren't the scale that they should be. Some of the bottom ends of the figures aren't the scale that they should be. The faces, some disappear, some don't. Even the amber colored hair of some of these figures, the way it's positioned indicates a bit more of a brushwork than hair. This isn't that Cezanne doesn't know how to do this. It isn't that Cezanne doesn't know how to render figures academically. It's just that he's trying to move away from that tradition to create this place that these figures occupy that is neither here nor there, neither of our time nor of the past, neither of an ancient Arcadian landscape where these nude women reside, nor of our own time, bathers circa 1900. This is all very exciting for everyone paying attention in around 1900, especially for Picasso, who is now eating this data up as quickly as he can. Picasso knows, just by looking at Cezanne, that Cezanne is moving away from representational imagery. Cezanne is moving away from things that we know exist in the real world, and he's moving toward this fictive world, this place where he can play with subjects. Here we have at the left Picasso's great declaration of 1907. It's a bit like his visual manifesto, a bit like his calling card. It's larger, it's confident, it's made for him at a moment when last year, 1906, was really great, full of all kinds of breakthroughs. 25 years old, he's convinced the Steins to fund another studio for him so that he has yet another place to work at the studio very famously called the Bateau Lavoir, the laundry boats. This is a moment in 1907 where Picasso is also sold his remaining early works to his dealer in Bois Villard for 2,500 francs. This is 500 francs more than Villard paid him in 1906, so he's making more money. He's getting more credibility. He's really feeling this urge to continue to plow through whatever occupies him. The money that he got, incidentally, from that sale allowed him to buy a much finer canvas, a much larger canvas that he then uses here for, some would argue, his great breakthrough painting, Demoiselle d'Avignon. The titles, The Young Ladies of Avignon, was given by an associate of Picasso, André Salmon, a poet, and it was changed from the original title called The Brothel of Avignon when it was first exhibited publicly in 1916. Did you catch that? The initial title was called The Brothel of Avignon, and here now for its first public exhibition, we have The Young Ladies of Avignon. That's very, very different. But in Picasso's mind, like Cézanne, he's playing fast and loose with how to render a body. But now he's doing that in the context of a brothel. And here we see 5 nude women, presumably at a brothel. We know the early sketches of this work show a male figure also at the brothel. This is something, by the way, Picasso has had some experience with. We know he's had some experience, especially in Barcelona, with his friend Casagemas. You'll remember him from last time. Here we see a current view of Demoiselle at the left at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, now paired with an also colossal or quite big painting by Faith Ringgold, the American People series number 20, Die. This is a very interesting moment for Picasso. This is a moment when viewers, scholars, all of us, we are getting together and re-examining him, especially here curatorially, with work that is very different. Whereas Picasso is male, think Ringgold is female, whereas Picasso is of European descent, Faith Ringgold is of African descent. And so it really changes so much of the conversation. So Picasso very much alive in terms of how we consider his works curatorially. While he painted the Demoiselle, Picasso was keeping one eye firmly on the El Greco that you see on the right, the Vision of St. John. He loved El Greco. Of course, El Greco, the Greek, is considered one of the great painters coming out of Spain. So Picasso has this nice connection to El Greco. The painting hung around the corner from Picasso's studio at the Bateau Lavoir, in the studio of one of his old buddies from Barcelona. And we know anecdotally that Picasso goes there quite a bit, trying to build his own image based on that of his predecessor and one of the greats. El Greco is very much in the pantheon of Spanish art. If you look at the composition, the way El Greco really uses all of the canvas from the very top to the very bottom. Look at that figure in blue at the left of the El Greco, the arms upraised, and then look over at the Picasso, again, using almost all of that verticality allowed to him from the very top all the way to the very bottom. So this is one of those opportunities that we can say Picasso is looking at the masters and quoting from the masters. Again, he's only 25. He's still looking to the masters for building some of his compositional ideas. This is also the moment that Picasso becomes even more interested in his contemporary Henri Matisse. And here, from the same year, Matisse's Blue Nude. Both present nude figures done in a way that are not anatomical, and both utilize this interest in non-European art, this interest in what in those days they would have considered tribal or primitive art. Now we wouldn't necessarily use those terms, certainly not primitive. At the right, Matisse sets his figure off in some, what he thinks is a foreign exotic landscape. It makes the figure seem that much more away from the known. Even the body is distorted. Same thing with Picasso. The figures are in a brothel, probably one not that far away, but we have the African masks that the figures at the right wear, and you see the traces on the faces of the other 3 figures of Picasso's experimentation with African masks. In other words, Picasso, through the Steins, meets Matisse and sees what he's up to with his interest in non-Western art and makes his own version of that. He is not one to be to be undone. Here, Einstein, what an odd little connection, right? And if you're interested in more about the connection between Picasso and his developing style and Einstein, there's a book from 2001 by Arthur Miller, not the playwright Arthur Miller, the other one, called Space-Time and the Beauty That Causes Havoc. And in this book, Arthur Miller lays out a very interesting case that has bothered art historians for a long, long time, whether or not Picasso was aware of Einstein's discoveries. You will know that in 1905, Einstein publishes his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, his theory of special relativity. The question is, does Picasso know of this? Answer, we think maybe, probably. How did he become aware of this? As Arthur Miller argues, through his friend, the actuary Maurice Princey, who was a part of Picasso's little band of people that got together every night and had a bit of wine and talked about all things artistic and philosophical and even scientific. So we know that Picasso becomes, we think, certainly aware of some of these ideas of Einstein. In that paper, Einstein writes this: two events simultaneous for some observer may not be simultaneous for another observer if those observers are in relative motion. What that means is that we don't have motion and space and time the way that we logically think about it on Earth, womb to tomb, everything moving in one direction forward. Einstein theorizes, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a new way to think, and maybe space and time are not separate, maybe they're in flux. Of course, later this moves from position of being theoretical to something that's observable by looking at how objects up in the celestial heavens, how they move and manipulate space as they go through. What does this mean for Picasso? Picasso presents a very curious situation where three of his figures are right in front of us, a few feet away, and we're there at the brothel looking at them, whereas two of his figures, the second from the left and the third from the left, seem to be rather lying down. Take a look at the white cloth, the sheet that the second figure from the left holds. Look at the legs, the position of figures 2 and 3 working leftward. These are figures more lying on a bed, and you see the white background really underscoring that. And if they're lying on a bed, then we, the viewer, hold the position of looking down upon them from above. And so in one painting, you're looking over at figures, but you're also looking down on them. And so the question is this simultaneity of perspective based on Einstein, or is this something Picasso's doing on his own? Scholars disagree, but it's certainly a very interesting piece of the puzzle. This question of putting figures and objects in the same space and time and manipulating them is something Picasso takes up with his good buddy Georges Braque. Here are comments that illustrate how close they were. Braque said, "We were like mountain climbers roped together." Picasso said, "Almost every evening, either I went to Braque's studio or Braque came to mine, and each of us had to see what the other one had done during the day." Braque, after the First World War, was never quite the same based on an injury he had received, but he still continued to paint and was a rather good painter. But in this moment before the war, Picasso and Braque painted side by side, and it takes a really good eye, someone who has looked at these a long, long time, and as they're on the screen, start thinking of differences to be able to differentiate. To Picasso at the left, perhaps a bit more geometric, heavy emphasis on line as he breaks up that man with the violin into all kinds of pieces. And at the right, perhaps Braque's has a bit more soft edges, a little more curvilinear qualities to the forms. But in either case, similar color palette, similar idea. The question hanging over both, can we continue to make a kind of art where we can break down the real world into forms that seem to fluctuate in and out of that real world, in and out of 2D, 3D, and now with Einstein, even 4D. This is something that will occupy Picasso for a long, long time, but he will move away from those exercises, what we now call analytic cubism, really by the onset of the First World War. After the war, Picasso is still moving and changing. Here at the right, photographed with his first wife, Olga Koklova, in Paris in 1919. Look at his costume. He's different now. He's not the bohemian renegade. He's a different figure. And this is a moment where not only is he married and dressed in this kind of bourgeois-leaning costume, but he's more credentialed, more people know him, more people like his work, and he's also a father. This is the beginning of the subject of the painting at the left, Woman and Child on the Seashore, 1921. This kind of sentimentality that's so different from those Picasso Braque pictures, which are much, much more about pulling an idea forward, quasi-scientifically, pulling an idea forward of, can we mix perspectives all in the same plane? Around 1921, and take a look, freeze this image in your brain at the left, this very lovely maternal moment by the seashore, taking in the sun, taking in the waves. And look at this pair of paintings he makes in the same year. And this doesn't even look like the work of the same artist. Here, about a decade after, Picasso is plowing through his analytic cubist works next to Braque. Now he comes back to his cubist works. And we can see, again, more of an emphasis on geometry, more of an emphasis on shapes moving in and out of his planes. But he does this after the war, recollecting his life before the war. It must have seemed like a long, long time ago, after those 4 dreadful years, 14 to 18. As the left 3 musicians in Philadelphia shows you, first and foremost, himself, Picasso, dressed as a harlequin. And I'm bringing back something we saw last time, Picasso in the Saltimbanques, where again, he's always wearing that harlequin costume, the costume of the court jester. The far right, Picasso holds the hand of his deceased sister. And here, a similar kind of looking back. This is a moment that Picasso is recollecting of a bygone era, an era where all of his friends were doing their experiments, whether in painting like Picasso or in poetry, like with the figure at the far right, or with a kind of breakdown of how linguistic aims and pictorial aims would come together in the figure in the center. This is Apollinaire, Guillaume Apollinaire. And Apollinaire is someone very much on Picasso's mind because he's feeling a little guilty. Apollinaire had died in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and here he's thinking back about him, what it was like in the good old days. Picasso, now married, now with a child, he recollects Apollinaire and feels a little guilty because Picasso got Apollinaire in a little bit of trouble. Around 1907, Picasso's Belgian friend Pierre stole 2 Iberian masks from the Louvre. These are from the 3rd and 5th century BCE. 1911, you might know that the Mona Lisa goes missing. The same day that the Mona Lisa goes missing, a French journal, the Paris Journal, seeks info about the Mona Lisa. Anyone can come, no questions asked, just give us information. And Pierre tells the Paris Journal, not about the Mona Lisa, he doesn't know anything about that, but about the 2 sculptures he gave to Picasso. And so Picasso and Apollinaire are brought in front of the magistrate and they incriminate each other. And as a result of this, Apollinaire goes off to the war and then he dies shortly thereafter in the flu. And he's very much thinking about this, recollecting. Here, the 3rd figure, Max Jacob, a poet that Picasso knew well, worked alongside, that believed he had a pretty major conversion. No one around him believed that except Picasso. And so here Picasso shows that figure in a Franciscan monk costume. Picasso knows moving forward, this is the kind of figure. Here in the 1930s, we see one of the loves of Picasso's wife, Marie-Thérèse Walter, here the dream where he just absolutely falls in love with her. This is 1927, while he's still married to Olga. Here we see Picasso show Marie-Thérèse in front of a mirror, the girl before a mirror, and the mirror representing a very different kind of image. He's conflicted perhaps about how he sees her. And this is the time, of course, that Picasso comes under the influence of Dali. They meet in 1928, and here, of course, is Dali's famous persistence of memory. Picasso is working with surrealism, working with psychology, working with looking inward, and indeed shows Marie-Thérèse looking inward into her own mirror. 1935, he falls in love with another love of his life, Dora Maar, and here the weeping woman, so different from how he presents Marie-Thérèse or even his first wife. This is 1935, he falls in love with her. By the way, 1936 was the year his daughter Maya was born to Marie-Thérèse, so he's got two great relationships happening at once. By 37, Picasso is an international superstar, and for no other reason than because of Guernica. By then, this absolutely solidifies his position. A great painting depicting the effects of the bombing in 1937 and April 27th by the Germans. Bombing lasts 3 hours in the small Basque village in northern Spain, chosen as bombing practice for Hitler. The city burns for 3 days, and 1,600 are dead and wounded, and this becomes one of the great images of war and protest. See arms severed, a mother holding her wounded or perhaps even dead child. This makes him, catapults him into international superstardom. Here we meet Picasso in the last quarter of his life. In 43, he meets Françoise Gillot. He was 61, she's 21. They never married. They spent 10 years together with 2 children, little Claude here, 47, and then Paloma born in 49. And you can see them all together at the left. Paolo born in 21, and little Claude, there's François Gillot. Of course, little Paloma there, Pablo Picasso, and then Maya, all together in the 50s. And at the right, drawing with Paloma. Here, Picasso and the last great love of his life, Jacqueline Roch. 53, he separates from François Gillot and meets Jacqueline, his final companion. She's 26, he's 72, and she dominates the last phase of his career. He paints over 400 portraits of her, more than any other companion. In this last phase, Picasso knows that we'll remember him as one of the greats, and he goes through the history of art, copying great paintings like the Las Meninas, manipulating them, giving his own spin on things, hoping to, in his mind anyway, fix some of the problems of these paintings. And then, of course, his life comes to an end. Here we see a painting done June 30th, 1972, a little less than a year before his death. Took several months to make. This is something where we can start to understand how Picasso's own life factors into things. And this is why I show you images of his life. It's one thing to only look at the work, but he was a living, breathing person too. He's told François Gillot, I paint the way some people write their autobiography. In other words, every time his life changes, his style changes. You can see how different the images of one love of his life are from the next love of his life. This is a moment where Picasso is coming to terms with what his life will be. One of his friends recollects Picasso holding this image up next to his face. Picasso held the drawing beside his face to show that the expression of fear was a contrivance. He didn't blink. I had the sudden impression, his friend said, that he was staring his own death in the face like a good Spaniard. April 8th, 1973, he dies at the age of 91 and left behind an estimated 50,000 works. 50,000. 1,885 paintings. That's extraordinary. 1,228 sculptures, 2,880 ceramics, about 12,000 drawings, prints, tapestries, rugs, you name it. Here we see Picasso looking out at his last moments. The person that outwitted death as a baby, born, his family thought a stillborn. The person who outwitted death when two of his siblings died. The person who kept going and going to become arguably the most influential painter, certainly of the 20th century. One of his good friends, the biographer John Richardson, said he was trying to outwit death. In this late body of work, the eyes are always Picasso's eyes. What a legacy.
Well, thank you, Matt. Matt, if you could stop sharing your screen, we can get into the Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone out there, to the nearly 1,000 people tuning in right now, you can submit a question using the question and answer icon at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's go back. One of our first questions was about Gertrude Stein. So Matt, did Picasso ever work from photo references for paintings such as Gertrude Stein?
Very good question. But Picasso, like lots of artists around him working in Paris, would have, by the early 20th century, start to see the necessity of photography. Picasso works with photography here and there, but for the portrait of Gertrude Stein, he's working primarily from the live. And so she goes to his studio 90 times and suffers really. And the big cloak she wears in that great painting in New York at the Met is a good example of that. Gertrude Stein is not used to living the way, in the conditions. She's quite comfortable, and yet she's in a freezing cold studio working for Picasso. So Picasso, the short answer, not as much as other people. Certainly he preferred working from the live, something he's working with even as a young boy.
Great. And Matt, just a reminder, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I thought this already did. Okay, my apologies. There we
go.
Yep.
Okay. Was Picasso, this is a question from Linda, was Picasso at all influenced by Ernest Hemingway, whom I think he also met Gertrude Stein?
That's exactly right. And again, the question points toward the bigger umbrella heading of those expatriates in Paris. Think of the community there. Think of everyone who was in and around Picasso, in and around that epicenter of avant-garde culture. Gertrude Stein certainly had lots of people she took under her wing. Was he influenced directly by Hemingway? You know, that's a fascinating thing. We think of Hemingway for his terse sentences and for his, in a way, sort of grouchiness against a kind of very lyrical, feathery, long-winded prose, a prose maybe typified mostly by Faulkner's. But we can make analogs to a kind of very quick rhetorical style and a kind of quick pictorial style, and that would be very fun. And that would be a nice thing to do, sort of read Hemingway alongside it. He's more in contact with someone like F. Scott Fitzgerald, and there's a great moment in the 1920s when the Fitzgerald, both Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald, husband and wife, are together with Picasso at moments in what's called the Villa America, a villa owned by Sarah and Gerald Murphy, two rich Americans who were also over there. So we get the sense of kind of parties that lasted all night with the Fitzgeralds, with the Picassos, with the Murphys, and all kinds of really interesting things there. So I would put that probably closer in terms of inspiration, but he would have no doubt been aware of what Hemingway was doing. Picasso was someone who was aware of what was going on. Thank you, Linda. That's a good one.
We have a question from Paula, and Paula wants to know if Picasso ever went to war, either in World War I and the Civil War or World War II.
Did Picasso ever go to war? Picasso did not go to war. No, he was born in 81. So by 1914, that would have made him 18 plus 14. So he's probably a bit out of drafting age. And certainly by the Second World War, he was a bit old. He did last through the Second World War, though, and managed to get supplies miraculously under Nazi-occupied Paris at the time. This is something that is legend, those moments under Nazi rule in Paris. No, he certainly responding to it and thinking about it and making works of art about it, but never a soldier.
So you said that Picasso created a prodigious amount of work at the end of his life. Beth would like to know, what is the average number of works created by an artist in their lifetime, and how does that compare to Picasso?
Oh my goodness, Beth, you're stumping me here. I'd have to get back to you. Some vary, but 50,000. I've never actually done the calculation. That's interesting. I will, Beth. I'm putting it in my head. It varies, but 50,000 puts you at a very, very high level of output. You think of someone like Mondrian, a contemporary of Picasso, who indeed became a cubist because of Picasso and Braque, and then went on to move to New York in the middle of the Second World War and died there. But Mondrian is someone who's beloved in the canon, but truly his style after 1921, when he invents his what's known as the neoplastic, the de Stijl grid of Mondrian, he works with that until his death in the early 40s. And so when we think of prolific, we think of the number, but we also think of, with Picasso, very unlike Mondrian, say, and others, how prolific he was in terms of new kinds of imagery. Think about it. If any of us could paint like Picasso in the blue period phase, you would just hold on to that forevermore. And that's something anyone would love to be able to do. Or the rose period, or the African inspired period, and then comes Cubism, and on and on and on. And so every few years, as some of the loves of his life have noted, biographies and the like, he takes on a new love of his life. He takes on a new style, sometimes a new studio, and he moves on. So the question of how prolific he is both a number, and no one comes near that number, but also how prolific he is in terms of the number of styles he takes on. 50,000 puts him pretty high.
Great. In terms of an inventory or a catalog of his work, is there a museum that has the largest collection? And then Tom would like to know, could you say something about Picasso and Albert Barnes, who bought quite a few of his works?
Yes, Tom, I am finishing up a second lecture series at the Barnes online, and soon to begin a third lecture series on the Barnes next week. It's about 20th century sculpture. So Picasso will factor into that quite a bit, because we didn't look at any sculpture at all by Picasso. But the question is, what was his relationship to Dr. Barnes? Yeah. Barnes had a very idiosyncratic taste. If he liked you, he liked the work of an artist, he collected as much as he can get his hands on. Very famously, he really appreciated the work of Renoir or Cézanne or Picasso or Matisse, people like this, Prendergast. Dr. Barnes is someone that when he liked something, he paid for it. And we know that this is how the great Matisse Joy of Life got to the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. This is how and why Dr. Barnes commissioned sort of second chapter of that, Matisse's dancing mural there. Same with Picasso. He was enamored by his work, adored his work, and certainly would have considered him one of the bearers of that Cézanne tradition.
Great. Let's see. Did any of his loves influence his technical aspect of his art? Not as the muse of the moment, but as an intellectual partner.
Yeah, wow, that's a fascinating question. And it's one of those questions that I can't, as a good art historian, answer, because I as a historian, I need data. I need verifiable proof, or else it's my opinion of things, and we can do a little bit of that, but we'd have to ask some of those people, right? You'd have to ask them, what did you really do with him? Did you give, Picasso ideas? Were you there alongside of him? So each of those stories, though, when we're mining for data, whether or not any of these people gave him intellectual ideas or were just the muse of the moment, as he said, well, you have to remember that a lot of those stories about Picasso, they come through the lens of being with Picasso or having been with Picasso. So sometimes you get a very disgruntled read of him, after a breakup or after, you can imagine how perhaps Marie Thérèse felt. She's just had a daughter with him and now he's taken on a new love. And so any data that we would need to answer that, did they or didn't they, would be filtered and probably tainted by their own experiences with him. But I think what we can do, rather than say, yes, Dora Maar did this, or, Marie Thérèse did that, we can say that he really changes every time he falls in love again. And when we look at, say, Dora Maar images throughout the war, they're so different. They're much harsher than the, say, Marie Thérèse or the François Gillot images that are Picasso just fully languid. And so it would be great to dig into this. This would be a wonderful master's thesis or dissertation. The muses and what they contributed. This sounds fascinating.
Did Picasso return the stolen masks?
Yes, poor guy. When he, I'm being facetious there. First of all, you don't take stolen merchandise from the Louvre. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. But yes, when the truth comes out that, well, and he says that he was more or less implicated. He did accept them. They were in a studio, but he didn't take them. And he doesn't get into trouble either. He gives them back and becomes one of those stories that you don't often hear. I brought it in with the Apollinaire, but you don't often hear that story. It's a fascinating one, though. I guess in those days at the Louvre, you could go and take things off shelves. I don't know.
A few more questions, Matt. Did Picasso take commissions for Guernica?
Guernica was made in 1937 upon the, not as a commission per se, but as a result of the Spanish government actually coming to him and asking, saying, you are a Spaniard, you are one of the greatest artists, you really need to do this. You need to help us show the world what we're up against now with the politics of Europe on the continent at that moment from 1937 onward. Hitler comes to power in 1933, so there was a vested interest on the part of the Spanish to get that painting out. Picasso agrees, ever the Spaniard, makes the painting, and then the painting goes on view at the 1937 exposition, and it becomes a place where lots and lots of people see it. But some of you probably know that because Picasso made this really for Spain, for the Spanish pavilion at the World's Fair that year, he didn't want the painting to go back to Spain until Franco was out. And that didn't happen until after Picasso died in 1973. Franco dies shortly thereafter. So it doesn't go back to Spain until 1981 on the centenary of Picasso's birth. And it's there that you can see it guarded all the time. But it's probably commission per se in the sense that he was asked, but it's not a commission like traditionally we think. This is more about national identity and politics and so on.
Okay, and we'll conclude with one final question, which should be easy for you to answer, Matt.
Okay.
Did Picasso have any regrets in his life with such a full life?
I'm going to give my stock answer that the art historian in me says, let's look for a way to answer this. And the way you would look to answer this is his comments. That's data. If someone has said something about someone he knew or an object, that's real when we look at how we felt about Barak and so on. So there's that part of it. And then the other part of it is what someone isn't saying. I always find it revealing, I'm sure all of you do too, that there are things that people don't say. And those are just as revealing as the things that people do say, because revealing things is part of a conscious effort to construct an identity or a kind of pitch if you're selling your art or your ideas. So what he says publicly, it could be guided by some of those instincts. Did he have regrets? Off the record then, he certainly lived a long life, up till 91 and did what he wanted to do. And a lot of creatives need to do that, but there's always fallout from that. When you are more focused on the work that you're producing than maybe the people that are around you, that becomes very quickly problematic. And there are lots of little stories about how Picasso treated the people around him and how they felt, maybe othered or ostracized or something, certainly marginalized. So maybe he had a regret there, but I think he was just too focused. He was too focused on his work at all costs, and maybe hopefully didn't have a, not maybe not hopefully, but maybe didn't have a whole lot of regrets.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt. I think with both of those lectures in the amount of time we had, you were able to provide a very comprehensive look at Picasso's life. So thank you very much.
Happy to do it. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Be well. Be safe.